Okay, well, I hope you're doing well. I'm videoing from my office, my home. This is obviously a very crazy time uh, during the coronavirus. For those watching on video, filming this or recording this on April the 5th, 2020. And and so it's just a very crazy time. We're kind of in basically, I guess, lockdown, shut down as far as going out of the house and getting things and so forth. I'm working from home, so I'm thankful to still be employed. A lot of people are not so fortunate, and we're seeing the economy suffer, and um, it's just a time in which we're just trusting the Lord that He's going to demonstrate once again His sovereignty and His control um, over the world and over the situations that we encounter. It's A lot of people are suffering, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiousness. We can see it just in um, people who are out and about, wearing masks and social distancing, and just a lot of uncertainty. And so it's a very interesting time. I was telling my children, I've got one in college, one is a senior in high school, and this is affecting her very closely because a lot of things have been canceled. Senior prom was canceled, and senior trip is canceled, and other senior events, and the graduation ceremony, that's kind of up in the air. And I was just expressing to my children that every generation, it seems like, has an event that is defining, sort of changing, altering. I know, I guess in my generation, there was 9/11, which drastically changed our outlook on the world and how we do things, and how we function and our mindset, and it really changed the course of events. And before that, there's other events in history: Vietnam, the Civil Rights movement, and World War II, and all of you can go back, and every generation has those defining moments. And for those that are seniors, many times they live through multiple of those defining events, and so it's just a very a time where we can reflect on what the Lord is going to do. Look to Him for our hope and our security, and even though we're not able to meet in public and in our places of worship, we can still worship Him, worship the Lord. And even with social media and technology and things, it's changing sort of the way that we, I guess, relate to each other and share life with each other. And just by this technology that I'm using now, able to continue to record and to share with you. And so my prayer is that you're doing well, that you're trusting in the Lord, that you're your faith is being sustained, and we know that the Lord holds the future. He knows what is to come, and it's all in His hands. There's a very little amount that we can actually control ourselves. Our sphere of influence and our realm of control is very limited, but we can be faithful with what God has given to us, and we can still study. We can still look to Him for our guidance and hope, and we can still pray. And so, just want to encourage you, if you're watching by video, then this is probably something that you're watching very much in the future. And so maybe you can reflect back on what was going on in your life during April of 2020, during this worldwide pandemic and all of the things that's going on. And so we're just going to trust the Lord. There's also in my life, I wanted to share in person, but obviously we're not able to do that. But within the past few weeks, I received a promotion or a job transfer to the Charlotte area. And my wife and I have been praying about moving to the Rock Hill, Charlotte area for some time, probably 10 years, I imagine, something like that, to be closer to family, particularly with the children graduating high school and moving out of the house. And so the opportunity presented itself. And so the plan is to move there this summer. But of course, with all of the things that's going on, that's added complications. Well, I shouldn't say complications, just makes things interesting to trust in the Lord of how He's going to work those things out. So just some areas of prayer. My wife has resigned her position at middle school where she has taught for the past 10 years. It's not coming back next year. And so we're praying that she will find a position in the Rock Hill school system. Also, our daughter is starting college in the fall, and we were put an application to be accepted at Winthrop University in Rock Hill. So we're praying that will come through, and we'll be able to get her situated in that school this fall. Also need to sell our house, which of course in the current environment, we're not sure how that's going to work out. But we know that the Lord has a plan for that. And we also need to have a place to live. And so all of those things are needs that we have. And so the Lord knows what they are. But I just share those with you just on a personal note, and just ask you to be in prayer for that. And we're going to continue tonight or today, whatever time you're watching this, and we're going to be looking at the book of Judges and begin that. We'll be looking at that. I'll probably film a video, two lectures. This is lecture 9. And we will do lecture 10 to finish up Judges. And so really excited about some of the things in the book of Judges. Judges is not one of the books that we typically focus a lot on. At least I haven't heard a whole lot of a sermon series through Judges. You hear sermons and teachings on various stories in Judges, which we'll talk about. There's obviously the story of Gideon. There's the story of Samson, and there's a few stories like that. But Judges can be kind of a difficult book to, I think, to deal with in some aspects. And again, we're not looking at the book as a book study. It would be a very interesting book to dive into very deeply and to look at in a book study type of format. But what we're trying to do is look at the theological themes, to look at the main structure and the canonical context and what the author is trying to present, what the author is trying to do, and present his overall message, which has a theological point, and how that fits within the canon and within the story, the unfolding revelation that we have been looking at. And so I want to just begin with as we think about Judges. There's a lot of stories, and so I don't want you to just take a, as I'm kind of talking, just think about the various stories, and there's a lot in there that have been very influential in my life, and probably in yours as well. We think of Gideon, mentioned him with his valiant 300. We remember the story about about the Lord calling him. He was in the wine press or threshing grain. And that was obviously when you threshed wheat, you wanted to be up on the hill. You wanted to be up where the wind could blow the husks away, and you didn't want to be threshing wheat, trying to get the wind to blow the husks away down in the middle of a pit. But out of fear for the Midianites raiding and coming through, they were taking such actions, hiding in caves and various things. And so we remember the story of Gideon and his 300 men with their clay pots and their trumpets and their torches. And it has, we see God's power demonstrated that. There's also some very strange stories, things in there. A lot of times things are very difficult for us to understand because we're so far removed from the historical context. We're so far removed from that culture, from that time period, that we really cannot understand a lot of the things that are going on. And so some of the things seem very odd to us. There's a story of Jephthah, who makes the vow to the Lord. If you remember, he says that if you, speaking to the Lord, he says, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me, when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Now, it's difficult for us to understand why a man would make such a vow. You think about who's coming out of your house. If you think about coming home from work or something like that, so who's going to come out of my house? Well, it's going to be my wife. It's going to be my daughter or my son or my pet or something like that. So the idea of offering a sacrifice as the first thing that comes out of your house seems kind of odd. But in that culture, of course, the animals and the livestock would have lived many times in the house. My understanding, they live in the house with you. So you would have your goats and your sheep and things like that would be in a section of the house, maybe underneath or on the side or somewhere. They would be right there with you. So it makes sense that he would think in his mind that, well, one of the animals will come out, one of the sheep or the goats or whatever's going to come out, and that's what I'm going to sacrifice. And he probably did not have any idea that his daughter would come out. But as it would happen, his daughter comes out dancing and coming to see him. And so he fought, and then more surprisingly, he follows through with this vow to the Lord to sacrifice his daughter. He allows her a month to go off with her friends, and then he apparently sacrifices her. It seems very odd, and particularly in light of the commands of the Lord specifically against such behavior. We read in Leviticus 18:21, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, which, that was that god was, you would take your child and you would lay them on the altar, and they would sizzle and burn the flesh, and that's how you sacrifice to that god. And the Lord says that, don't do that, for you must not profane the name of the Lord, the name of your God. I am the Lord. Also in Deuteronomy 18:10 says, let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire. So the idea that he would do that, it just seems to us to be so unusual or so weird that it's hard for us to understand. And in particular, that he would make that kind of vow to the Lord, and then he would go through with it and feel like he needed to fulfill it, and that idea that God would somehow want that, or something to that effect. And we have to remember is that in the scriptures, when we read something like that, it doesn't mean that is acceptable behavior, that's what the Lord wanted. What we are reading is accounts of men who don't always make very good choices, who were reading about their failures as well as their successes. So so when we read that, we should not read that and say, well, God wanted him to sacrifice his daughter. There's nothing in the text that would lend us to believe that. But that is an odd story. There's also the story of the Levite and his concubine. Now, this is very, very interesting situation here, with the Levite having this concubine. There were rules that governed marital relationships with a Levite, and so there's some discussion about what this means about him having this concubine. Could mean that he wanted to have the benefits, I would say that, of a concubine, but not actually having the responsibility of a wife. And so there's some odd things there. But this Levite has a concubine, and we read the story about her being brutally raped and murdered outside of the door where he's staying and spending the night. If you remember, in the town, the men came to take him, actually, and they threw the concubine out there, and they brutally raped her and left her dead in the morning and killed her. And so and he gave her over. So he was guilty. Maybe not to the same degree, but certainly in kind of what the atrocity that they did on her. So we have that story, and then he takes her body and cuts her into 12 pieces and mails her or sends her around throughout Israel, which is that whole event. Then starts the events of a civil war. Resulting in the death of tens of thousands of Israelites and Benjamites. So it's a very brutal story, very brutal account. And so we have this story. It's very odd. It's very strange. It seems very grotesque. And the author obviously puts it in there to explain how the Civil War began. But the narrative of Judges reads pretty straightforward. There's nothing really, I think, complicated in reading it. It's very straightforward. It mirrors the curses that we read in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68. So there's a lot of curses that we've already studied and looked at very briefly. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 45 and 49 through 51, there's a whole section there of scripture, but we read this. It says, all these curses will come on you. They will pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you did not obey the Lord your God and observe the commands and decrees he gave you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the ends of the earth, like an eagle swooping down, a nation whose language you will not understand, a fierce-looking nation without respect for the old or pity for the young. They will devour the young of your livestock and the crops of your land until you are destroyed. They will leave you no grain, new wine, or olive oil, nor any calves of your herds or lambs or your flocks until you are ruined. And so we have these curses that if they do not follow the Lord, if they do not follow the covenant with the Lord, then they will have these curses. And Judges really kind of mirrors a lot of these curses that we read about in Deuteronomy. So we're having this lived out really in the lives of the Israelites in the book of Judges. Now, the book also begins and it lays out sort of the foundation and telegraphs, if you use that word, telegraphs, that the future monarch, King David and Jesus, will come from the line of Judah and not from the line of Benjamin, which would be Saul. So if you remember later, when we read in 1 Samuel, that Saul is, or first of all, let me back up, the Israelites demand a king, We find that the Samuel's sons are judges, but they're not very good judges. They fail the people, and so the people want a king. We find that they're being disobedient, and that the Lord is to be their king, but they want a king just like the other nations, the Ammonites and so forth, and so they want a king as well. So the Lord gives them what they want. He gives them Saul from the line of Benjamin, and later we find through Saul is very jealous and very prideful, and he disobeys the Lord. He offers a sacrifice when he was not supposed to, and he does some other things. And so the Lord takes the kingdom away from him, essentially, and gives it to David. And so he takes it from the house of Benjamin and gives it to the house of Judah. And we find later that Jesus ultimately comes from the line of Judah. So we have this kind of telegraphed in Judges chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, where we read, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us is to go first and fight the Canaanites? And the Lord answered, Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands. And later, also, we see at the end of the book, or later in the book, in chapter 20, verse 18, we read, the Israelites went up to Bethel and inquired of God. They said, who of us is to go up first to fight against the Benjamites? And the Lord answered, Judah shall go up first. So there's a couple instances here of Judah being called out to go first. And so this is kind of in a way, it kind of telegraphs, I guess, that later on that the tribe of Judah will have a very prominent place in the history of Israel, and particularly in the establishment of the monarch. Now, the narrative of Judges covers a period from Joshua's death all the way to the inauguration of Saul's monarchy in 1 Samuel chapter 12. It's about 1050 BC. So we're quite some time away removed from this from these events. But this gives you sort of a time period. Now the period is defined. This whole period that we're going to study and we'll talk about is defined by disorder, moral breakdown. There's a cycle of disobedience. God is raising up leaders to rescue Israel, and then they relapse into disobedience, and they spend time in bondage or in suffering and oppression, and then God raises another leader and leads them out, and then there's a period in which they follow until that leader dies, and then they cycle back into this period of disobedience. And so there we read about this whole cycle that continues, just continues. It's just cyclical, I guess we could say, through this whole story. However, the timeline is not accounted for by simply adding up the lives of the and time frames of the individual judges. In other words, you can't just take the judges and line them up and say, well, this judge was a judge for X number of years, and then he died, and then the next one came along, and you can't add it up that way. This is it doesn't fit the time period, doesn't fit the total number of time. We find in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, and in 1 Kings, I'll flip there real quick. In chapter 6 in verse 1, we read this, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So we have the traditional ideas, the traditional teaching is that that this period covers roughly 480 years or something along those lines. But you can't just add the judges up and come up with 480 years. That's my point. So the scholars have tried to reconcile this and to figure out, how do we get to the 480 years by looking at the lives of the judges. And there's certain proposals that have been made, such as, excluding the minor judges that are listed in the book from the calculation. However, really the best explanation, I believe, is just to understand and appreciate that these are local stories of tribal heroes, okay, and tribal events, and they likely just overlapped in retelling of the story. So, it's likely that these judges lived overlapped in their time frame. So, one judge might have lived at the same time that another one was living, and so forth. And we have to understand and appreciate that these judges were, it was over a particular territory, a particular tribe, a particular area. So, these are tribal stories that would have been initially told orally and passed down by tradition, and then would have been recorded by the narrator for a particular purpose and particular point, to express a particular idea. And he would have assembled these particular stories in order and selected them, of course, guided by the Lord and his direction, but would have selected these stories for a purpose, to communicate a message. And so what we have are stories that most likely overlap. It's important for us to understand that the book is not written, the book of Judges, just like many of the other Old Testament narratives that we've talked about, is not written for the simple purpose of telling a historical narrative. Okay, it's not simply there to tell, what happened first, what happened second, what happened third, and give a history, like we might read a book on U.S. history or something like that. A book on U.S. history the whole purpose is to tell us the key events in order that they happened, so we can read, and it's, this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened, and we read it in a history like that. That's not the purpose of the book. The authors would not have, that was not their intention for writing it. Of course, there are historical accounts, and they are truthful when the writers are intending to tell something that actually happened. So Gideon actually defeated the Midianites with 300 people with trumpets and clay pots and lanterns. I mean, that's a historical event, but it's not necessarily to say that it happened in a particular order, a particular sequence, or that these are the only judges that there were. They're told in with a purpose in mind, and not necessarily just to communicate historical events during a time period. So I have to remember that, because it's a difference. If we were writing it, we were more interested sometimes in thinking about the historical idea, or matching up the time frame, that kind of thing. So just to be aware that there is a lot of discussion about the time period and how those figures are reconciled. The author of the book is really unknown. We don't know. It is evident that, as I mentioned, the author, and I'll refer to him as a narrator sometimes, but the author purposely selected and arranged these stories. They have been preserved through oral tradition. These judges were tribal leaders, as I mentioned, and the heroes, and they were bound geographically to a specific region. And these accounts overlapped, certainly. The tribal leaders would have, their stories would have overlapped to some degree. It's important to understand that the narrator evaluates these heroes, and as we'll see later, he presents the judges in order of their success to their failure. So there is a downward slope, if we can say it that way, downward slope on the degradation the failure of the judges. We start off with the very successful judge, and then we gradually move down the line until we end up with Samson, who was really just a failure in many respects. He did not deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. He did some things, but he did a lot of things wrong, and he ultimately paid the price for it. So we find that these judges are presented in a particular order on purpose by the author or the narrator. So the author, the narrator, is judging these or evaluating these heroes based on their keeping of the covenant of the Lord and their ability to deliver Israel from the foreign oppressors. So the narrator is kind of evaluating the judges as we go through, and that's why it's I almost use the word dangerous. That's not really the word I want to use. It's just I guess it'd be problematic, let me put it that way too, to take one of the stories, say Samson or say Gideon or something like that, without considering the context of the entire book and the purpose of what the author is trying to do, because without understanding the overall scope of the book and where this particular judge fits within that context, it would be difficult to appreciate the full meaning that the narrator intended. So we have to be careful of that. And so I think that's, even in my studying this, has kind of really impacted me in thinking of, well, if I was to preach again on Gideon, which I've done in the past, but if I preach it again differently, my approach would be a little different, because I would want to not just consider the story of Gideon and what the Lord did in that particular situation, but I'd also want to consider where Gideon falls within the scope of the narrator's presentation of the judges. You know, it's the fact that Gideon falls where he does is significant, and so we want to keep those things in mind as well. Okay, so at the beginning of Joshua, if you remember, there was a leadership gap. So we had the death of Moses, and it was immediately filled by Joshua, though. So we had Joshua, who had been prepared, already was an aide of Moses, was already being developed, was being groomed, if we can say it that way, to take Moses' place, and he did. And so, but like Joshua in the book of Judges opens with a lack of leadership. So we have the death of Joshua. However, unlike the story of Joshua, there's no leader to fill the gap. And so immediately in the beginning of Judges, we are encountered this absence of leadership. So there's this crisis that results from an absence of leadership. Now, the narrator presents a series of judges who are increasingly inadequate, okay, and they fail to lead the people to keep the covenant with Yahweh. So we find that they become increasingly, as they become removed from Joshua in that generation, they become increasingly increasing failures, if we can say it that way, right? So there's a period of, if we mentioned, there's a period of about 480 years or thereabouts. And that's a long time. Many times I think when we read the Bible, we read something like that, say 480 years, and we don't think about it because, and I guess in the scope of when we think about what Jesus was on the earth 2,000 years ago, we think, this happened, 3,000 years ago, something like that. Then we think 480 years just seem like a lot, but 480 years ago would put us back in Martin Luther, the Reformation, 1550 or something like that. So that's a long time. I mean, that's we're going back. If we're you think about if you're sure if you're watching my video, you might be in a different country, you might be in a different area. You think about the history. I know here in the United States, where I am, the history. I mean, we go back. You go back 100 years, 200 years. We're back. Civil War and a few hundred years, and the founding of the country, and going back 480 years. That's a long time. So if we think about these generations that are succeeding each other in this land, and to think too that we're in our day, in our culture, there's so much change. Things change so fast, just with technology. Just in my lifetime, I just turned yesterday. I had a birthday, as I'm turned 49. So just in my life, and depending on who I talk to, if I talk to someone in their 20s, I'm ancient. I'm old. I see the gray hair, and they offer me the senior coffee at Hardee's, and I'm considered old. But to others who are seniors, look at me and say, well, I'm young. I have a lot of life left in me. But still, at 49, I have seen a lot, and a lot of changes, and just in technology. I was telling my wife just today that it would, if someone would have told us back when we were teenagers that one day we'll carry our phone in our pocket, and we would have thought they were crazy. It's just the technology and the advances and how things change. But prior to the last 100 years or so, technology did not change. Things continued on basically unchanged for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there was not a whole lot of advancement. Of course, there were some things that obviously would have changed, but certain events. But it basically, it was a agricultural type of society, and you raised your sheep, and in that particular day you had, war was a common occurrence, and raiding parties, and just the way that the culture was set up. It's just a different culture, different time, but it went unchanged for 400 and some odd years. And so, but what we see that's significant is that as the generations moved further and further away from Joshua and his generation, the generations the judges and the generation began to abandon the Lord even more, to become like the Canaanites, and like the foreign people that they lived among. So so just to keep that in mind. But there's this lack of leadership at the beginning of Judges, and the narrator's presenting these judges in this increasingly inadequate presentation of these judges. So in the point is being made that the Israel needs this covenant keeping king, right? It's setting the stage for what's to come next. And Samuel, as we'll look at next after this, Lord willing, we see that what Israel needs is a king that keeps the covenant with the Lord. So Saul breaks the covenant with the Lord, is disobedient, and so God raises up King David, and that whole process there through Samuel. Now, it's interesting, the judges, actually Samuel is the last judge, but it's not, Samuel is not included within the book of Judges, and so is in the book of obviously Samuel, that's named after him, which takes his in the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, really deals with those three characters: Samuel, Saul, and David. Those three individuals. And so we find Samuel at the beginning. He is the leader over Israel as the judge, the final judge there. And then he transitions the kingdom over to Saul. And then we read about the difficult period of transitioning over to David, which is a very difficult period there. So, but we find that what the narrator is presenting, really setting the stage for, is that Israel needed a covenant-keeping king. They needed someone who was going to lead them and keep the covenant. And what we find is that these judges are inadequate. So like Joshua, the book of Judges opens with a brief summary of the books, of the preceding book. So there is a summary. So for we can compare, and we kind of look at, if we look at Joshua, and we go back to chapter 24, and we read verse 28 through 31. And this is at the end of the book of Joshua. And then Joshua dismissed the people, each to their own inheritance. And after these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnah Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gosh. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. So we read that at the end of Joshua. Then we come over to the book of Judges, and we read in chapter 2, verses 6 through 9. We read sort of a recap of that. So it's reminding us of what has happened. Is after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him, and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Okay, so we read sort of a recap. Now there is a definite contrast between the covenant-keeping generation of Joshua and which was the second generation to leave Egypt, and the subsequent covenant-breaking generation. So we can think of it this way: when the Israelites left out of Egypt, remember that the Israelites were Egyptianized, if you will, in their thinking. And they were really unable to break free from a lot of the Egyptian worldview, the mindset, and so forth. And so we find that when they came to the Promised Land, that they did not have they lacked the faith to trust God to go into the Promised Land and to take the land. As a result, God punished them and made them walk around the wilderness for 40 years. While they dropped dead through the wilderness, and then God took their children, led by Joshua, and they went into the land. They crossed over the Jordan. They went into the land, and they conquered the land. And so they fulfilled everything that they were supposed to do. There were, of course, some failures that we read about. Of course, the failure with Ai and some other instances. But for the most part, they followed the Lord, and they had conquered the land. Now, when we end with Joshua, they hadn't fully conquered the land. No, there were still pockets that they still needed to take, to expand into. But for the most part, they had expanded into the area that God had for them. And so after that, though, after what we read is that after the Joshua and that generation died, there was not a leader to come along behind Joshua and to lead the people into following the covenant of God. And we find them in the foreign land and surrounded by foreign people with their foreign idol worship, and so forth. And so so this is what we find. So this particular generation then begins to abandon the Lord and begins to abandon the covenant. And we find very sad that we read that they did not know the Lord. They did not remember the things that God had done. They weren't there. So it was all different. And so I think there's something to be said about this in our life. There's we can serve the Lord, we can trust the Lord, we can love the Lord, we can, of course, we have our failures, but we can also serve Him as much as we're able to. But we're just really one or two generations away as a country, as a people, from losing our moorings and losing our faith in the Lord. And so it just shows the importance of passing on just our understanding of God and who He is for the next generation. Because if we drop the ball, so to speak, and we don't pass it on to the next generation to teach them to follow and to love the Lord, then it doesn't take long. It doesn't take long at all for people to abandon the Lord and accept the culture that is around them, whether that be the foreign gods of Baal and Asherah and Molech, as the Israelites had, or whether it just be our current environment, the secularized, anti-God, just humanistic, naturalistic, worship of nature and of self. Whether it be that, it doesn't matter, because it's so easy and so very quickly can a culture just abdicate to the society and the culture around them, and faith in the Lord can be lost very, very quickly. So what we find is that this particular generation, the third generation out of Egypt, beginning there, abandoned Yahweh in favor of serving the Canaanite fertility gods. Now, we can kind of appreciate why the fertility gods would have been so appealing in that culture, because everything was centered on offspring, family, and having children with the land and the agricultural setting and with the fertility that was needed just to live. And so we can kind of understand and appreciate the importance in the minds of the Israelites of the fertility. And so all of these gods that they would have had around them, that others would have worshipped, and it could very well be, I'm speculating here, and I'm going to be careful not to speculate too much, but if you looked over and you saw this other tribe, this other people group, the Amorites or somebody, and they seem to be doing very well, they seem to be very blessed, they seem to be having a lot of children, having a lot of crops, having a lot of success, and they were worshiping their Baal or their god or whatever it was, then it would be very, very, very appealing to want to add that particular god to your worship, so that you can also have that particular fertility success or what have you. So you could see sort of the if we kind of imagine in that context what it would be like, we can see sort of the appeal of worshiping these other deities and these other gods. And there was a so what we find is, though, that as Joshua and the covenant keeping generation, I'll call them that, as they came in and they claimed the land for God, for Yahweh, and they enacted altars, or they erected altars to Yahweh. And what we find with this generation is that in the book of Judges, it tells how the subsequent generation basically built altars to the Canaanite gods, to Baal and so forth, and essentially gave the land back to the pagan deities. So they come into the promised land and they claim the land for Yahweh, and then the next generation essentially gives the land back in a way by worshiping the other deities. So we discover that, in a couple of places it tells us this in Judges, in chapter 17 verse 6, chapter 21 verse 25, that it says, in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. And this kind of just defines the period. Everyone did as they saw fit. Had no king, had no covenant keeping king. They did not follow Yahweh. They did as they saw fit. And so that's and I think we could take that and apply it to our generation or our culture and say, well, our culture for the most part, people just do as they see fit, as they think best, and that's a problem, because I think even the temptation for us oftentimes, I say us, including myself, but is to rely on feelings, how I feel about something and what I feel like we ought to do, and if it feels good to me, it feels like it's going to meet my need, then that's what we want to do. And so it's kind of the same thing, doing whatever everyone did as they saw fit to do. And so this, it really kind of lays the foundation. It sets the stage for King David when he comes on the scene, of the real importance of having a king after God's own heart, having someone that, even though he had very many failures, that he was one who honored the Lord in many ways and kept covenant with him. And so that it just sets the stage in preparation for the king. And I think we think about it, in that particular context when it was being written, that that the audience would have understood and would have appreciated that that King David ultimately was to be their covenant king, with Solomon and so forth, and leading into that. And so this would have really set the stage to understand and appreciate what God was doing in establishing the monarch. So we can understand that. Now, from our modern day perspective of geography and globalization, it's difficult for us to, I think, fully appreciate the political environment that would have been going on. So when we read the books of Exodus and Joshua and so forth, and we come to view the Israelites as traveling as a group, the Israelites are traveling together through the wilderness, of course, in Exodus, and we read about them in Leviticus and so forth. And then in Joshua, they're coming in, they're conquering the land, and they're doing these things as a group. And so we know there are 12 tribes of people descending from the sons of Jacob. However, after the land was allotted, what we have to appreciate and understand is that after the land was allotted, the tribal units functioned separately and were really separated by mountains and valleys. So you would have tribes in different areas, different locations, separated by mountains and valleys, and they didn't have phones and internet and these types of things. So each tribe really had their own tribal leaders, had their own individual concerns and challenges. They might have had their own enemies, own problems. There was not one unifying governmental structure. So we have to appreciate that. So there was no, this is before the time of the king, of the monarch. So there was really no, and this is of course before the divided kingdom and all of that, but there would have been really just individual tribes living with their own individual concerns and their own individual challenges. And so instead of a national interest, the interest of, say, Israel as a whole, you would have the personal interests of the individual tribes that would take priority. The tribes, of course, would ask each other for help, as we read about in the book. And sometimes they would fail to provide the aid. And sometimes when the aid's given, there is a personal interest that's at issue, the reason for them doing it, and so forth. And so there's a lot of political things that are going on. It's difficult for us to understand because we don't understand the political context of what's going on. But we have to at least understand that there is some political aspect that is going on. So, for example, when we read about Gideon and he confronts the oppressive Midianites, he defeats the Midianites, and we think, wow, that's a wonderful thing. He defeated the Midianites with 300. He's got them on the run. He's chasing them down. He calls the rest of the people to come help. And we read in chapter 6, verse 35, he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also to Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali. And so they too went up to meet them. Okay, so we got all these people coming to chase the Midianites. And later, after the defeat of the Midianites, read this in chapter 8, after the defeat of the Midianites, you read, now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian? And they challenged him vigorously. Okay, so we find this in chapter 8, verse 1. So we find this interesting situation, political situation really, that Gideon goes and he fights the Midianites, he beats the Midianites, he has them on the run, defeats them, and frees Israel from the oppression. And so you would think that this would be everyone would be celebrating, and this is great. Let's throw a parade and let's have a celebration. But what we find is the Ephraimites are upset, and they challenged Gideon the Bible tells us, very vigorously, because he didn't call them or something. There was something they felt slighted in some way. And so, we read I also read that the Ammonites again were oppressing Gilead. We read this later in chapter 11. And the elders went to Jephthah from the land of Tob and said, come, be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites. It's chapter 11, verse 6. And in response, Jephthah said, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? That's in chapter 11, verse 9. So there's this political back and forth. Okay, I'll come and lead you, but how do I know I'm going to be your head or be your leader, and so forth. So we have a lot of political and self-interest. I guess I'll put it that way. It's not a lot of self-sacrifice here. We have a lot of self-interest that we're looking out for number one, so to speak. And so, after God gave the Ammonites into his hand, we find the Ephraimites again. They felt slighted, and we find that this chapter 12, the Ephraimite forces were called out. They crossed over Zaphon. And they said to Jephthah, why did you go to fight the Ammonites without calling us to go with you? We're going to burn down your house over your head. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone burns down my house over my head, that's a bad thing. And so we find that Jephthah answers and says, I and my people were engaged in a great struggle with the Ammonites, and although I called, you didn't save me out of their hands, and when I saw that you wouldn't help, I took my life in my own hands. Now why have you come up against me to fight? Right? So we're talking about fights between tribes, between the Israelites. This is not with the enemy. This is with each other. And as a result of this dispute, we find, and this is hard to imagine, but what the Bible says, that because of this dispute between these tribes, we read that 42,000 Ephraimites were killed. They had a dispute between the tribes over the Ephraimites feeling slighted and accusing the other tribe, and them getting into a conflict, and we read about, and 42,000 Ephraimites were killed. I mean, that is a lot of people to die over something that when we read about it, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But my point is that there is a political aspect that is going on that we, particularly if we're going to study this in depth, we would want to get into the idea of what is the political nature, political context, environment that's going on, because we have to understand some of this political stuff to understand for these stories to make any sense to us. So there is a lot of civil unrest that we read about in the story. The Israelites not only fought with pagan and foreign enemies, but sadly they fought with themselves. They fought against each other. So in many respects, these civil conflicts were more costly and devastating than the actual conflicts with the Canaanites. In many of these stories that we read about with the civil fights between tribes, tens of thousands of Israelites are killed, and these are fights and wars between tribes and between the Israelites. Now it's hard for us to understand how they got to this point, because when we read about them coming out of Egypt and coming through the wilderness, even when they were disobedient and they were marching through the wilderness, they were still unified. They were still as one. They had their tribes. They had their they were still separated by their tribes, and they marched out, and so forth. But there wasn't this kind of civil war going on between the tribes. So how they get to this point is difficult to understand, but we have to appreciate it as part of part of what is going on here in this story. So significantly, to emphasize the theological and spiritual unity, the narrator uses the tribal names as a form of address, but he refers to the people as Israel. Okay, the narrator uses the name Israel in 152 verses in the book of Judges. So even though he's talking about individual tribes, and this is significant, I think, even though he's talking about specific tribes, and he uses those particular names, the tribal names, as forms of address, he refers to the people as Israel. So there's a unifying aspect that the narrator is attempting to communicate. And in 152 verses in this book, he uses the word Israel to refer to the people. So although the judges ruled specific regions, and this is key, I think. Although the judges ruled specific regions and they were involved in individual tribal concerns, we have to appreciate that the narrator presented these specific stories as a representation of the history of Israel and the tribes as a whole. So, for the purpose of communicating a unifying message. So, let me say that again. So, the point is that the narrator, even though the judges ruled specific regions, and they had specific tribal concerns, each individual judge, the narrator presents these stories as a representation of what's going on in Israel during this time period, and as the tribes as a whole. And we know this because he uses the word Israel to refer to the people, but he also specifically picks out and selects individual tribal stories about individual judges and leaders and heroes. So he's presenting these select stories of these judges and these heroes in order to communicate a unifying message to represent the entire history of Israel, what is going on during this entire 480 year or so period of time. Okay, so the book is not read, like I mentioned, as though the author is trying to present a historical narrative, including all of the judges, or presenting the judges in a historical sequence or anything like that. Rather, the individual stories should be understood within the context of the whole. So, in the context of the entire book is how we have to understand each individual story. So the question we need to ask ourselves as we read through this is, why this particular order, right? Why does the narrator present these particular judges or leaders in this particular order? Additionally, we want to consider, what theological message did the narrator intend to communicate to the nation as a whole? Remember, he's speaking to the nation as a whole through these the retelling of these localized tribal stories. So, what theological message is the narrator attempting to communicate to the nation as a whole by presenting these localized tribal stories? And those are a couple of key questions that we want to reflect upon. Why did he present them in this order? And then also, what is the theological message which the narrator is trying to communicate to the nation as a whole? So the book of Judges really presents a case study for syncretism. Okay, now we were studying in Dr. Gary's class on hermeneutics. We're studying about the concept of syncretism. And which generally means is the combination of different forms of belief or practice. And for Christians, it can mean the merger of biblical and non-biblical beliefs to form some kind of hybrid, or we could say an unacceptable religion, right? You don't want to to merge together, Christianity and Mormonism, for example, and try to come up with something else. It's you don't want to try to merge these things together. But this is, but what we find in Judges is really sort of a case study in syncretism. And so we see through the narration that the Israelites, they break the first commandment, and when they break the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. When you break the first commandment, you find that the other commandments quickly fall away. I mean, you quickly break the other commandments because, by the very nature of it, by breaking the first commandment, you will naturally break all of the rest of them. And so we find, in this story, we find, them worship, building idols, and we find stories of, disobedience to parents, and we find theft, and we find covetousness, and we find all kinds of things in here, all of these things. But first and foremost, they break the first commandment, and the Israelites, as a result, they become increasingly Canaanized by the incremental syncretism with Baal worship. And so this idea of syncretism, of merging together the worship of Yahweh with, say, the worship of Baal or Ashtoreth, it explains in some ways why Jephthah, as we mentioned previously, why he would make such a vow to the Lord, and then why he would follow through with sacrificing his daughter, which would be sort of a practice that would have been done by the pagan and the foreign nations. This is what they would have done. They would have sacrificed their children to their gods. And so, why would he make such a vow? Why would he do this? Well, it's because he was Canaanized. The worldview of the Canaanites, their concept of God and appeasing God and so forth, of sacrificing children, this had been ingrained into their mindset, and so this would have been something that would have seemed right somehow to them because of the syncretization that had been taking place. Okay, it explains perhaps why Gideon would make a golden ephod. After defeating the Midianites, what does he do? He gathers up golden earrings and he forms them into an ephod, and he ends up worshiping it. And we read that all of Israel prostitutes themselves by worshiping the ephod. And we said, what is going on? Why are you doing this, Gideon? You just defeated the Midianites. God has delivered them into your hand. You've had this miraculous victory. And the first thing you do is make an ephod and begin to worship it. It doesn't make any sense. But when we think in terms of the syncretism of merging of these worldviews, merging of these religions, and trying to take some of Baal worship and bring it over and mix it with the worship of Yahweh, we can understand why perhaps this seemed appropriate to Gideon at the time. And so this is what God warned against. This is why he said not to have any gods before him. This is, there is no mixing of any gods with Yahweh. We learned all through Deuteronomy that, there is one God. That's the key message of the Shema that we read about in Deuteronomy chapter 6. That there's hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. There, not to have any gods before Him. And so with the other pagan nations, they could have multiple gods. They could mix the gods up like they're going through a buffet or something, or they're going through a cafeteria, and they can take a little of this and take a little of that and mix it up, and the more gods the merrier. But with Yahweh, this was not something that you could do. You could not mix Yahweh's worship of Yahweh, the one God, with other deities. But this is exactly what the Israelites were doing, and so the culture had impacted them to such a degree that their worldview had changed, and so they were viewing things through the lens of syncretism, really of blending together the worship of Baal with the worship of Yahweh. So just like the first generation, as we talked about, they were Egyptianized, right, with the culture and the context of Egypt and all of their worship of their gods and their deities and their way of doing things. In the same way, or very very similarly, the third generation and all succeeding generations became Canaanized in their thinking and their worldview. They blended the worldviews that were diametrically opposed to the law and the requirements for a covenant relationship with Yahweh. So the covenant relationship with Yahweh required certain things. Certain things they were to do, certain things they were not to do, and by following the religions of the Canaanites, these two things did not mix together. They did not go together. So you could not do that, but they were doing it. And so as I mentioned, the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6 was really the heart of the law. I mean, it was really the covenant relationship, and the Lord was very clear, very adamant. There was no question to to the people what God wanted. And we read, you know, in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and the whole section there, but particularly verse 10 and verse 12 through 15, you know, we read, you know, says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Fear the Lord your God, serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the peoples around you, for the Lord your God, who is among you, is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you, and he will destroy you from the face of the land. Okay, I don't know how you get any more clearer than that, right? I mean, that's if God was going to be, you know, say something very plainly, that is it. You know, do not worship other gods. I am a jealous God. I will basically destroy you from the face of the land. I mean, that's, you know, this crystal clear. You cannot mix the worship of Baal with the worship of Yahweh, but that is what they were attempting to do. Okay. Now, the book of Judges is very interesting in that it has a double introduction and it has a double conclusion. Okay, so there's basically two introductions to the book, which we're going to look at. We'll start at looking at tonight or today on this video. I don't know when you're watching it. I'm filming it late at night, but we're going to look at there's two introductions to the book of Judges. So what we're going to do is look at the two introductions, and then we'll look at the main judges. Have a few comments about those as we work through the book, and then we'll talk about the conclusions of the book, and hopefully get an idea of what the narrator, what the author is trying to communicate theologically. And that's the goal. That's what we're hoping to accomplish. So the book opens with this double introduction, which really serves to establish important patterns that are developed in the unfolding narrative, and it creates sort of a literary expectation for the reader. So we read the introductions, and then we understand in the literary sense what we expect to happen. Okay, so he's really setting the stage. So we look at the beginning of chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verse 5, and then we have chapter 2 verse 6 through chapter 3 verse 6. That's really kind of how we divide this up. So chapter 1 verse 1 through 2 verse 5 describes the pattern of Israel's increasing failure to drive out the Canaanites. So what we see is that we see a pattern, and what we're looking at are patterns that the author is attempting to lay out. Okay, laying out some patterns. And the first patterns he's laying out is Israel's increasing failure to drive out the Canaanites. Okay, this pattern is developed in the order of the judges as they are revealed as progressively degenerate. As I think I mentioned this earlier, that we find that the judges get progressively worse. Okay, in fulfilling their duties as covenant keeping leaders of Israel, from Othniel to Samson. Right? The judges are described as increasing degrees of failure, concluding with Samson, who even fails to deliver the Israelites from the Philistine enemy. So we have this sort of this downward spiral, if you will. You think of it that way. So the narrator selected 12 judges. There's some minor judges as well, but 12 main judges, and holds their narrative reports together by this sevenfold interpretive framework, okay, that we'll talk about here in a minute, that connects and unifies the narration, suggesting that they are manifestations of the same basic phenomenon, reoccurring cyclically in Israelite history. So he's presenting each of these judges to show this same type of cyclical cycle of events that's happening in Israel. And that's what he's doing in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 5. He's describing this pattern of Israel's increasing failure to drive out the Canaanites. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. In the second part of the introduction, the second introduction, chapters 2 verse 6 through chapter 3 verse 6, what the author is doing is describing a pattern of the cycles, okay, that become the framework for the main section of the book. Okay, so again, to recap, the first introduction, he is expressing the pattern of Israel's increasing failure to drive out the Canaanites. Okay, so they're failing to do what they were supposed to do, which is drive out the Canaanites. And then the second introduction sets the pattern of the cycles that become the framework for the main section of the book. So when we read the main section of the book, that's where we get the stories of Gideon and Samson and Deborah and all of the others. And so we get sort of a pattern, a cyclical pattern. Now, the main cycles can be seen in the account of Othniel, and they're kind of generalized. And we see, and so I want to look at at Othniel in the last a few minutes that we have. I'm not going to take a full 2 hours here, but I think we've already been looking at my clock here. I think we were about an hour and 20 minutes or something like this, another 15 minutes or so. So just want to look at this real quick. I want to look at this pattern that's sort of established here. And we see this if we take your Bibles and we go to Judges chapter 3, and we come to Othniel. Now remember that Othniel is actually Caleb's nephew. So, and we know this because in Judges chapter 1, verse 13, we read, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him in marriage. So we have his nephew, and he's married Caleb's daughter. And this is Othniel. This is the first judge that we read about. And so we're just going to read this in verse 7 through 11. And we see the cyclical pattern that is going to be repeated more or less through the other stories and judges that we read about. It's also interesting to note that as you go through this book, the first judge is the judge that is closest to the covenant-keeping generation. This is, of course, Caleb's nephew. He leads correctly. We don't find any negative things about him, but it's also the shortest narration. So the significant about that is that as we progress through the book, when we get to the judges that are worse, I'll put it that way, or they degrade further, further they degrade, I guess we say it that way, the longer the narrative, the longer the narration that we have, the dedicated, the words dedicated to that story. So interestingly, with Othniel, he is really the best judge, if you will, for fulfilling his duty, but it's also the shortest amount of language, amount of space allotted to him. So, but this is what we read. Othniel, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. Again, this is on chapter 3, verse 7. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. Okay, but when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Now, notice nothing negative, nothing there to indicate that Othniel did anything incorrect. He delivered the Israelites, and so this is the cycle that we read about, though. So we'll look at this in basically nine things, I guess you would say, and we see it all right here in these verses. So the first thing is we read that Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, Israel rebels. Israel does something evil. So we read that in verse 7. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, they forgot the Lord. It tells us their God, and they served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. Okay. The second thing that we find in this cycle, the cyclical period, is that the Lord gives or sells or causes them to become into bondage, gives them into the hands of the oppressor, basically. So we read this in verse 8. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. Okay, so that's the second thing. The Lord is punishing them. He sells them into the hand of the oppressors. Then we read that Israel served the oppressor for X number of years. Okay, so in this particular case, again in verse 8, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. So we read that Israel was subject to them for a period of time. And the period of time will be different, but there is some period of time. Then we find in verse 9 that Israel cries out to the Lord. Now, significantly, we'll look at later that as things progress and get worse at some point, Israel doesn't cry out to the Lord. But here we find that this is the basic cyclical pattern. That Israel cries out to the Lord in verse 9. But when they cried out to the Lord, okay, then we find that the fifth part of the cycle. Remember, first, Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Second, the Lord gives them into the hands of the oppressor. Third, Israel serves the oppressor for X number of years. Israel cries out to the Lord, number 4. And in number 5, the Lord raises up a deliverer. Okay? When they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel. Okay? Then we find in verse 10 that the Spirit of the Lord is upon the deliverer. Okay, so the Spirit of the Lord is responsible for coming on to the deliverer. It says, verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came on him. Okay, very, very clear. Then the oppressor is subdued. This is also in verse 10. So that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. Okay. And then we read that the land had peace for X number of years. This is number 8. So the land had peace for a number of years. This is in verse 11. So the land had peace for 40 years. And then we find number 9, the ninth part of the cycle, the judge dies. And then we read that until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Okay, so in these verses 7 through 11, very short period of text. It tells us about Othniel, but it also establishes sort of this this framework that we see. So in chapter 2, verse 6, all the way through chapter 3, verse 6, that's what we see, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the introduction, chapter 1 and through chapter 3 here in just I believe we're going to do that on the next lecture. We'll stop right there for now, and then we'll pick up with looking at the introduction on lecture 10, and we'll cover hopefully the rest of the rest of the book of Judges gives sort of a brief overview of that. So let's have a word of prayer. Let's just remembering the time that we're in. Very, very difficult, very challenging for a lot of people. Not sure what your situation is. Again, with the social distancing, it's really kind of difficult, because as human beings, and particularly as Christians, brothers, when we face difficult times, what we naturally want to do is we want to get together. We want to be around people. We want to be around our friends, around our brothers, and around our relatives, and so forth. And it's during this time that we're really encouraged not to do that for safety's sake. I know myself. I had a birthday yesterday, and I generally like to maybe go see my parents or something like that. And of course, my parents are, they're just mother's has some underlying health issues and so forth, and we don't want to take a chance. Don't want to risk spreading any kind of illness, and we're not sure how this thing works, because we read that you don't have to have any symptoms to be a carrier and spread it around, and so we're just being very careful. But what that means is that we are, where we naturally, in times of difficulty, we want to be around each other, and to find solace, I guess, in each other's company. We're unable to do that. So I'm not sure what your situation is. I wish we could be in person and speaking to each other, but we're just thankful for the opportunity that we have to share this to share this time together, even in these electronic means. So just with that, I'm just going to have a word of prayer, and then we'll end until the next lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much that you are a sovereign God, that you are in control of everything in this situation, Father, that we find ourselves in. Lord, it did not take you by surprise. You are in control of all things, and Lord, we trust you, Father. We know that you will work all things out for good to those who love you and are called according to your purpose. We pray, Father, for each man who's watching this video, each person, that you would just bless them in a special way, Father, that you would just uplift them and their families. You protect them, keep them safe, and help them to trust in you, Lord. Just that you would alleviate any kind of anxieties or difficulties that they're facing, that they would just you not remove all of those challenges, but Father, that you would provide them a sense of peace and comfort during the midst of these times. Lord, we just ask, Father, for your continued grace and your continued presence in our lives, and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.